Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Reparations is a big issue, and getting bigger every day. It's not going away. California has been forced to have to actually table the issue, and it hasn't been allowed to die a natural death. And due to the direct and persistent efforts of the black grassroots, shout out to Brother Tariq, that task force has been kept on track, despite numerous attempts by certain interested parties to try to go another way. Well, the white media, seeing that this whole thing isn't going to just vanish or evaporate, it's not going to disappear down the memory hole, they've decided that it's time for them to go ahead and start putting their thumb on the scales heavy. And talk about the right tool for the right job, they brought in the Aryan propagandists, otherwise known as AP, to go ahead and sell the soap. Having failed to derail or otherwise bury the issue of reparations and seeing that black folks this generation are not letting it go, the white media has gone back to what I told you was going to be their fallback position, which is redefine reparations. And that's what the white media is going to be using its media monopoly to do. To just blast everywhere, carpet bomb everybody with lies that, well, reparations is anything at all. Now, the AP article talking about the California task force lists the 5 harms experienced by black people. Of course, we all know it's a lot more than just 5, but still. The 5 harms being government taking of property, devaluation of black-owned businesses, housing discrimination and homelessness, mass incarceration and over-policing, and health. Now, of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with listing those 5 things. Those are legitimate harms that black people experience constantly. But the white media is not here to address those things. The white media is here to do a bait and switch. See, the article 2 paragraphs after this says the task force must determine when each harm began and ended. When the harm began and ended? Now that right there is the white media trying to use some Jedi mind trick. Telling you, well, the harms against you, they did come to an end, you know. Yeah, I guess they did. No, they didn't. There's not a dang one of these things that has not been going on for 500 years and that we are not suffering all the way to the present. None of this stuff ended. The article also says the task force must determine who should be eligible for monetary compensation in those areas. For example, the group could choose to limit cash compensation to people incarcerated between 1970, when more people started being in prison for drug-related crimes, to the present. Look at the wording. The group could choose to limit cash compensation to people incarcerated between 1970 and the present. And it tries to limit the whole topic of the turbocharging of the prison industrial complex against black people to the 1970s. As if that's when the racial targeting of black people for incarceration began. It's as if the chain gangs hadn't existed over in the offices of the Associated Press. They're pushing that line hard. Oh, well, this is about the drug war, you see. It's about the drug war. I mean, there was a beginning and an end to it, don't you know? I mean, it wasn't really that long when you think. It really wasn't that long. It's like Noam Chomsky said in his lecture about the manufacture of consent. The primary tool that the white media uses to control the public mind is the bounding of debate, to try to set up from the outset certain predetermined limits to how far the conversation should go. So when it comes to talk about reparations, the AP's saying, well, we should only limit it from 1970 to the present. They're going to set up artificial limits. They're going to set up artificial boundaries. So if you talk about what's going on before 1970, well, that's really going a little bit too far. I mean, that's really, the mass incarceration didn't begin until the 70s. That's a damn lie. But that's also part of the white media's job. Their job is to try to give the talking points to the dominant society, everybody outside the black community. That's what this is about. Here's the talking points, everybody. We're giving out the talking points. Talking points going to be that, well, you can't really talk about the incarceration of black people as a group outside of, say, 1970. I mean, 1970 was when it began. This is to set up an artificial, phony timeline to limit the damage that was done to us so that they can also limit how much we take out of their behinds. The Aryan propagandist piece also writes, earlier this year, the committee made the controversial decision to limit reparations to descendants of black people in the United States as of the 19th century, either as freed or enslaved people. Now, isn't that interesting? Before now, this same white media pretended not to know who would qualify for reparations, and they acted like there was no way to know who does, and that nobody had specified who, when in reality it was just white noise or rhetorical smokescreen to try to muddy the waters. The white media also complained that if reparations were paid, it would be an unimaginably huge sum and that America simply can't afford it, so we shouldn't be talking about it, etc., etc. But now, after decades of the white media talking about how reparations would just be too much money and can't figure out who qualifies or who it applies to, etc., now you got the Associated Press saying that limiting reparations only to those whose ancestry goes back to the killing fields of the American South, well, that's controversial. Well, gee, shouldn't that be sensible, you would think? Why, restricting the number of people, making it where not just any black person can apply for it, shouldn't that be sensible? Shouldn't that be moderate? Isn't that the word they should be using? Should be a moderate view of reparations. Why, they're not just saying that any old black person from anywhere on the planet should qualify. Why, they're saying limited. It should be called a moderate measure. They should be saying that it's a moderate one, but they're not. They're saying it's controversial. And they can't even tell you what makes it controversial. Look at the paragraph for yourself. They just say it's controversial, and then they run off, like a juvenile delinquent who throws a rock and hides their hands. Yeah, it's controversial, we just can't tell you why. Now, you would think that the white media, above all others, would be just so glad that the people who are demanding reparations are also being very circumspect about who it should apply to, and that you can't just apply it to anyone simply because they're black. You have to have come out of the specific historical experience. But they're not glad about it, they're actually upset about it. Because white power spent a long time and a lot of money setting up the American racial paradigm. And a number of individuals who have played along with it have been classified as black. So now that you got the former slaves who are stepping forward and saying, we're going to be upsetting this order altogether, you got the white media leading the charge to go, we can't let that happen. They want to say that anyone and everyone should be able to qualify. That way they can shoehorn in a whole bunch of tethers and also a bunch of people who previously identified as white who will suddenly begin claiming that they had a great-great-great-great-grandfather on their mother's side who was black, and that this alleged black ancestor, though they never spent a day in bondage, they were black and that's good enough, so give them some money. It's going to be the $5 Indian hustle, only now it's going to be the $5 Negro hustle. And the white media wants to make sure that they lay the groundwork for that. But it was what the AP wrote next that was the topper for me. They commented that Boston City Council has formed a reparations task force. Now, one of the things I've been warning you about from the jump is that these white supremacists would be on a jihad to redefine what counts as reparations, and that they would make sure that whatever that definition is, it isn't going to be cash. This AP article made a big deal of pointing out that Evanston, Illinois has already instituted a reparations program. They've already begun giving reparations. That's a damn lie. We see what Evanston, Illinois has been doing, and they haven't been paying reparations at all. Even the white media is forced to admit that Evanston's so-called reparations plan has no cash payments, and it's not even linked to slavery. Reparations is all about one thing and one thing only: slavery in the United States. And yet you got Evanston saying, hey, we got a reparations plan, but it doesn't have anything to do with slavery at all. Oh, and there's not going to be any cash payments, mind you. Their idea of reparations, a measly $25,000 so-called grant, that's actually nothing more than a housing voucher. Now, they don't call it a housing voucher, but that's exactly what it is. Because you're not allowed to deposit it. You can't keep the money. Instead, this voucher, that's what I'm calling it because that's what it is. It's only good if you're going to use it for house repairs, to put a down payment on a house, or to pay for a mortgage. And predictably, the result, which was the entire point, was to make sure that the pool of eligible applicants would be practically non-existent. It's limited only to residents who lived in Evanston before 1969. Only about 120 people applied in the first so-called round, and out of that 120, looks like only about 16 of them were randomly chosen to receive a voucher. That ain't no dang payout. They just put condition after condition after condition on it, and you got the white media claiming that this is reparations that have been given out. Yeah, because this is the kind of reparations they approve of. None whatsoever. That's not reparations at all. That's a scam. because black people never get to realize the income. They never actually get to have any money. All they get is a voucher that can only be used at a hardware store or a home improvement store, which will be owned by white people. Or they can use it to make a payment on a mortgage that will be held by a white lender. Or they can make a down payment with a bank or mortgage lender, which will be white. This is a windfall for white corporations. And how many of those white politicians in Evanston who came up with this scam are in the real estate business themselves? How many of their family members or friends are? This is money for them and their relatives and pals. Reparations are about repairing the economic damage done to black people who came out of slavery in this country. And a tiny housing voucher doesn't repair anything. This is an insult that Evanston's doing, but that's exactly the point that it was meant to be. Evanston has a track record of racism as putrid as the day is long. This is exactly the kind of sick racist joke that they would get a kick out of. So that's the reason why they pulled this mess. But the white media, they're going to play along with it and pretend, oh, this is a real effort at reparations. Why, look what Evanston's doing. There's reparations got paid. And of course, they'll ignore all the black people saying this isn't reparations at all. The white media will not report that, hey, this isn't reparations. Black people didn't ask for that. And just look at this isn't reparations. What kind of reparations is this? They're not going to do that because the white media's job is to maintain the status quo, not to challenge it. But the scumbags have the nerve to say that Evanston is paying its black residents. Black residents ain't getting one thin dime. But that's the entire point. The white media's job is to maintain the racist status quo through lies. Because when the U.S. paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned for a couple of years, the U.S. didn't give them a housing voucher. It gave them cash. The Jews have gotten cash from the German government. The Red Indians in the United States have gotten the works. In every single scenario where these groups have been paid for reparations, there's cash that has always changed hands. That is, until they get to us. They get to us and all of a sudden, we're supposed to settle for, well, whatever. No chance. This is why we have to push back hard whenever these bootlicks call themselves getting in front of the white media or going to some publication and saying, why, money for the HBCUs, that should count as reparations. That's the white media line. That's the propaganda. Why, look, these Negroes are getting paid reparations, see? And the white supremacists in the society will take that talking point that the white media hands them, and they'll claim, well, look at these niggers are getting this undeserved, these housing vouchers, it is undeserved. They'll just go ahead and go along with it as if black people were getting paid the lotto or something. And the white media will never point out that no black person has gotten one thin dime out of these reparations, and that it's all going straight to white companies. Nobody will point that out. It's like a bad comedy movie. White power is going to give itself a gift and then turn around and claim that they gave you something. If you're a black person wanting to start a business, you can't use a housing voucher for that. Most black people in Illinois don't own their home, and for the young black folks, they can't even get one. And considering housing prices, $25,000 is a joke and not a funny one. By the way, on a side note, in the article talking about Boston's reparation task force, the Associated Press mentioned a scheme in Providence, Rhode Island, where that city's mayor proposed using federal money for what he called reparations. And what is the mayor of Providence's idea of reparations? Financial literacy and home ownership, workforce training, small business development, and other programs recently recommended by the city's Reparations Commission. Again, watch out for the trick bag language. Financial literacy, what does that mean? That means they're going to be paying some white consultants to come to your local library and tell you you need to save more money or you can invest it with them. Workforce training, well, we all know what that means. You'll take a course, which the government's going to be having some white company administer, so that you can go work for another white company. Small business development, that's a phrase that's so vague it can mean anything at all, or it can mean absolutely nothing. But what it won't mean is money in your hands. By the way, the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, is a white Latino named Jorge Elorza. And yes, he's a Democrat. We get closer and closer to the threat of real reparations actually being paid. The white media is going to be stepping up its efforts to try to redefine reparations as anything at all other than cash. And it's going to go from simply them saying this to basically being, well, you need to settle for something other than that because that would be the right thing to do. You're obligated to take something other than cash in your hands. I warned you. A lot of us have warned you this is what they would do because they have to try to derail this somehow. They're testing our resolve to see if we stick to our guns or if we'll either give up or, even worse than that, we'll let them go ahead and dictate to us what reparations is. Well, we haven't been paid reparations until we say they've been paid. And reparations is not a housing voucher, not even a large one. This racist country owes us a hell of a lot more than that, and they owe it in cash. We will decide how our reparations are to be spent. What we won't have are the very racist white politicians who have used their position to persecute us, telling us what reparations are and how much it's going to be. They're not paying black people anything. When you get paid, you keep the payment. This is something that black people will never get the chance to even touch if we let the white media tell us what reparations are. What Evanston is doing is not reparations. What Providence is proposing is not reparations. The fight is on to ensure that reparations doesn't happen, because we've lost our fear of being unpopular with any of these other groups. And we're starting to do a whole lot of talking back and pushing back. And we're demanding things specifically for us, and we're making it clear that no, these other groups are not to be included. So they know that discouraging us or shaming us isn't going to work. Telling us lies about, well, Uncle Sam, he ain't good for the money anymore, that's not going to work. So now they've resorted to this plan B. Okay, if we can't get you guys to give up on reparations, we're going to try to redefine what reparations are. A phony scheme to transfer money from one white interested party to the hands of another white interested party and claim that because a black person's name was on a voucher list somewhere, that's reparations. You know, white GIs got benefits when they came back from both of the world wars. And especially the ones who came back from World War II, they got taken care of nicely. They got their education paid for in full with the GI Bill, and they got housing loans that were extremely low rates. The government basically buying them houses, what that was. And what they didn't get, however, was redlined or discriminated against in housing, education, or employment, mainly because there was a whole lot of these white GIs coming back, them and their relatives and family members and friends. They were the ones doing the discriminating. So we see the white media realizing black people will not be shamed out of exercising the essential selfishness of survival. Thank you very much, Dr. John Henry Clark. The California Task Force has been kept on track by the black grassroots. But never let anyone tell you that anything other than cash payments counts as reparations. Not housing vouchers or educational vouchers or student loan relief, none of that's reparations. One thing and one thing only counts as reparations, and that's cutting the check. And that check must be cut directly to us and put in our hands. Reparations means cash in our hands. When they enslaved us, it wasn't to get a housing voucher. These white supremacists, they didn't say, we're going to enslave these black folks so we can get a housing voucher. They didn't say, we're going to enslave these black people so we can get some workforce training for ourselves. We're going to enslave these black people so we can get some educational assistance. No. They did it so that they could line their own pockets with the wealth that we created. Well, now the rent is due with interest. We're here for real reparations, and we're not accepting any substitute. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Kenneth Prescia, Wesley Monroe, Sean, Keith B., and Shantae Thompson. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.